I'm so excited to have you here. The most
Well,
knowledgeable person on the topic of Roswell is absolutely fantastic. I'm so excited. It's so great that you're here. I got a
thank you.
million questions and I just don't know where to start. Number one, don't you think it's interesting that history repeats itself?
Oh, yes.
In the time of Roswell, the Air Force was created.
Right.
Now, in the
Right after.
terms of the Nimitz, the Space
Mhm.
Force is created. So we
Yes.
can talk
Yeah,
about that a little bit later because I think that is extremely interesting. But because you
I would
had
agree.
direct contact to Dr. Hynek,
Hmm.
and I think he's pivotal in the whole question of the Roswell thing. Um,
Yes,
I'm really curious because on the beginning, Hynek was more on the debunker side.
absolutely.
What got him on the other side? What was that where you said, okay, holy shit, excuse my French.
No, no,
I'm
no,
trying to hold back. I tend to
no.
cuss. It's because I have a lack of,
No,
of
it's not his
words.
fault. He's Canadian.
I'm Canadian, yeah. But I
I
live in
know.
Europe.
I mean,
So, it's all kind of all mixed up
I've
here.
been to Canada many times, and I love Canada. So
I do too, but I live in Europe and I just love the food here. So I stuck here, and I got a wonderful wife and
you
kids.
got
No,
that. You got that. You got that. So.
no, but what got Hynek
Mhm.
convinced that he said, okay, wait a minute,
Right.
this is odd.
Well, one of the things people think that when Hynek was with Project Blue Book down at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, and originally he was at Ohio State in Columbus, Ohio, just down the road. That's how they selected him. And then from there, he moved up to Evanston, Northwestern University, just north of Chicago, head of the astronomy department there. And
Right.
he would only go down to Wright Pat once a month. That was his typical assignment. And he would wade through all the reports accumulated throughout those preceding weeks since his last visit. And one of the things that really struck Hynek odd was that he became this magnet, as I used that word earlier, and that pilots were seeking him out, both commercial and military. And they were confiding to him off the record about some of the most fantastic encounters while these pilots were airborne, while they were, piloting their planes. And so then Hynek would get the blue book, would get the right pat, and he'd wade through the reports and well, where's that report with pilot so-and-so? And where's that report with Lufthansa or that report with American Air? They were never there. So Hynek realized that, the hardcore, as he would use that word, cases were not going to Blue Book. They were going directly to Washington.
Oh,
So,
wow.
so he saw early on that contrary to what they kept assuring him, he was not going to have total access. He was not going to have full access to the data. It was going to be censored. And he was appalled by that
Mhm.
because they were clearly covering up the true nature of the investigation. So then, as Hynek was demanding to interview witnesses because they kept him on a short leash. They had their own investigators, they were military, and they would only have Hynek trot out to the cameras and the microphones to come up with a debunking explanation after a publicized case. He finally also realized that all these people can't be lying. They're all describing something fantastic beyond even the scope of science as we know it.
Mhm.
And all it's going to take is one to be genuine, and it blows the lid off of this. Well, then there were cases that happened in the 1960s, and most specifically, the landing in April of 64 of Socorro, New Mexico, the Lonnie Zamora case. And that was the landing, and where Zamora, a police officer, witnessed two occupants standing, outside the egg-shaped craft. And Hynek was sent by Blue Book to investigate. The CIA was involved. The FBI was involved. And Hynek came away totally convinced that the case was genuine. And in fact, even the Air Force couldn't explain it away. They referred to the craft as a vehicle. In other words, it was someone's hardware.
Mhm.
And as much as Hynek tried to explain it away, he couldn't. And so Hynek from there on became a pariah to the military. They realized that they had lost him. And it's right after that that they then initiated the infamous Condon Committee, Edward U. Condon, where
Right.
they came out as far where they explained it all away, and the Air Force saw it as a scapegoat to wash their hands of it, and they still kept Hynek on a short leash. For the next 4 years, he still consulted with Wright-Patterson, and his job description was consultant on controversial aerial phenomenon. Left us all those documents that we found after he died. No one had any idea that Hynek was still working with the Air Force on UFOs post Blue Book, but there they were. And
I have another.
Robert, go ahead.
Sorry, I think this is absolutely amazing, but there's so many questions popping into my mind. Sorry, dudes, if I'm just interjecting. I'm just so excited. This is absolutely phenomenal. I have somebody who knows Hynek. I mean, that is almost like having the Roswell UFO standing in front of me. That is
Well,
that is absolutely fantastic. Now,
I'm flattered for Dr. Hynek.
I have a question, because and this is what interests me, because I think this is what's going on in the background, is the problematic we're having right now, even to today, with now Fravor coming out, which I think is incredibly. I want to get your take on that too a little bit later, because that got me back into the topic. For me, kid, yes, UFO, Roswell, I was just focused on that. Bob Lazar just got me excited. I'm a geologist, actually. I mean, I deal in art, but I'm a geologist, so I have a scientific background. I'm very skeptical too. But what really fascinates me about this whole question is, who's got this fudging UFO? Is it the Army? Is it the Air Force? Because that was just a period where the Air Force was being created. I understand, because of the atomic bomb, and they were trying to think, they were thinking ahead with missiles and rockets, and we've got to sparse it. And this was obviously also a matter of interest, because within the military, who gets the funding? The Army got a lot of money then, So, right, okay. The retrieval, I think, was the Army, wasn't it?
It was an Army incident, absolutely.
So who's got the UFO, the Army or the Air Force?
And another great question, because when the Air Force, because the split off happened by the end of the year, Roswell happened in July, and then like Roswell Army Airfield became Walker Field in January of 48. Wright Field became Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So the split off officially happened in January of 48. So what's interesting is that in 1994, when Colonel Richard Weaver had a press conference at the Pentagon, and they came out with their third official explanation on Roswell, and that being the Mogul Russian spy balloon. Same balloon, but that it was part of a top secret project at that time. Doesn't matter that they still would have recognized the balloon, but no, it was because it was top secret. Well, BS, I'm sorry. We explained that away within days. Nothing to that. But the point being that here was the Air Force, and it was the Secretary of the Air Force then, Sheila Windhall, who signed as far as an absolution for all former Air Force personnel that they were absolved of their security oaths regarding Roswell. And that was a red herring.
Wow.
That was a big deal, because it wasn't Air Force, it was an Army incident. And the press didn't pick up on it. We had to educate our American media that this was an Army incident. There was no Air Force at that time.
You know what why I'm asking right now? Because this is, and it's so funny how history repeats itself. And my friends, look, I'm just asking questions, all these things are coming to my mind. It's so interesting how history repeats itself. We're having this whole crazy balloon stuff again. All right.
Right.
And it seems it's the same stupid story. And it seems to be such a simple psychology. Oh, we use that balloon excuse way back when, use it now. Let's not show the other stuff we shot down. This one thing was obvious, shoot that down. Everybody's going to swallow it. Everything moves so fast anyway. And we have the same situation right now with the Space Force being created. And now I'm really interested how does this work, that if a new kind of segment of the military is being created, the Air Force, okay, the Army is, we complain about the Air Force right now that they're not saying anything, but the Army is not saying anything either.
No,
they're getting away. The only part that has come out is the Navy, okay,
right.
Which I think is very interesting. It kind of leads me, and I'm speculating, I don't know enough about this, that behind the scenes there is a kind of a fight for funds and a fight for kind of like who's more important now. But how can the Army, who was like in 1947 after the Second World War, like the most important thing for America in the sense of military and security and everything, do you think they would have lightly given away the whole thing to the Air Force?
Well, again, excellent question, because in as much as the Air Force in, maintaining, our sovereign airspace here in the States, the Navy has even much more global coverage when you think about it. And as a result, we have long suspected that the Navy has actually been monitoring incognito, very silently, a global perspective on the subject. Whereas our Air Force would be limited. We couldn't, they weren't retrieving cases from other pilots, other countries. Whereas the Navy, they had that level of involvement. What struck us unusual to begin with, when the Project Blue Book files were declassified in 1977, and there were 13,000 some cases, 701 that remained unexplained. And yet they claimed they were all, 701 remain unexplained.
Wow.
That's insane.
You would think that a good portion of those would be United States Navy, United States Army, Marine Corps. They're not. You can count them on two hands. Of the 13,000 cases, there's barely a one that is Navy, Army, Marine Corps, National, you name it.
Mm-hmm.
So where did all those reports go? All those case investigations. They didn't go to Blue Book. They didn't go to the Air Force, because you're absolutely correct. We still have strong competition, not only between, as far as departments of intelligence, whether it is NSA, CIA, FBI, but our branches of the military. And I think a prime example of that was at the beginning of Desert Storm. And if you remember the name Norman Schwarzkopf, who was Chief of Staff of the Army. And at a press conference the day after the first attack over Baghdad, he was complaining that nobody was on the same page, that the Air Force had announced that they had total air supremacy by late that first night. The Navy was still launching Tomahawk missiles into the city, and the Army didn't know if they were supposed to march into downtown Baghdad or not, because again, nobody was talking with one another. And yet it's the same military, but it's not. They do compete. They compete as far as their budgets, and Space Force is going to create another whole element. And that's going to take money away from the other branches.
I think this is where we have to I think this is going to be the big telltale in the future. Because one thing that a lot of people don't know is I think it was September 1947, there was something else created, the CIA.
Yes, yes.
And how come, FBI is federal, so it's more concerned what's happening within America. And I don't know they probably had some other secret services. I'm not so acquainted with everything. But
there was secret service at that time, right?
Yeah, but to absolutely create to independent, a central intelligence agency, which is actually concerned about global intelligence, yeah, and the Air Force, so everything that's airborne, has been created within 1 year. I don't think that ever happened in the history of America, ever.
No.
So I'm convinced that there is a connection with what happened in Roswell.
You make another excellent point in that we also have to consider that the National Security Act was also signed by President Truman within days
exactly.
after Roswell.
Right.
And for the first time, Americans could be spied on. Everyone was suspect from the national media on down. And it's like, why were we all being watched? What had happened that now Americans even became suspect? Now, mind you, this is 2 years after the atomic bomb. It's 2 years after the ending of World War II. The Cold War has not even begun. The Russians would not detonate their own first atomic bomb for 2 more years in August of 1949. So what had happened in 47? Well, the creation of Israel? Well, no, that hardly would impact us here in the States. But National Security Act and the predecessor to the CIA was Counterintelligence Corps. In fact, Roswell had its own CIC Corps at the base. These were plainclothes military. The difference with the CIA is that they're no longer military. They're government agents. They're plainclothes now, and they're spying on everyone, not only across the sea, but here in the States. So it's like the chance that somebody would stumble upon the truth, whether it be the subject of flying saucers or anything else. They needed to be watched. If anybody came up with a piece of wreckage from the crash, and I could tell you stories for an hour about how for years they were knocking on people's doors and they were confiscating, they were ransacking people's homes, still retrieving wreckage. And it wasn't balloon wreckage. And so you make all these excellent points as far as how it all seemed to come together at that very time.
All comes together. And I always say the CIA was not created initially to investigate the others. It was created to keep a secret. I'm convinced. I'm convinced about it because they were just there's some. I mean, this whole question about the balloon is so pathetic as it is today with a balloon shot down. Because, I mean, as you said, there are too many important people who know. I watched a lot of your interviews, and I love them all. It's pathetic to say it's a balloon or dummies dropped out, and they were just adapting their excuses. I believe you said something really smart one time that you said.
Only one time? Only one time. Okay.
Again, he's Canadian.
I'm Canadian. No, but this is, I would actually, this one time that was so specific. I've never heard a witness to say, yes, it was a balloon. Not one.
No, not a one.
That's the best. That's such an effective comment for this whole incident, because it's redundantly stupid to think that nobody saw a big jackass balloon floating around and it somehow crashed and whatever, Even this balloon right now, a lot of people saw and filmed and put it on TikTok and Twitter and all this crazy social media, So
excellent point in that. And even when it's airborne, you recognize it for what it is. It's a balloon.
It's a balloon. Yeah.
And then the thought that the people in charge of the atomic bomb, that once it is on the ground, all shredded and torn in front of you, and you hold it in your hands, and then you leap to the conclusion, oh my God, we're being invaded. These are pieces of a flying saucer. I mean, at some point, someone's going to step, forward and go, wait a minute, I think that's a piece of rubber there, or I think, that's a piece of foil or something. But here 75 going on 76 years later, the government, in building their case, has not come up with a single witness to the contrary. Not a one. Not a one.
I I got all the questions, dudes. I'm sorry that I'm just like
Oh,
No,
please,
I'm
please do, man.
I'm really on speed now. This is totally
Oh.
exciting.
Yeah.
Now with this new legislation that's come out with a whistleblower protection program, do you think we have any hope that some people? I think most of the people who like were their life are not alive anymore, or who were there present probably are not alive anymore. But do you think anybody who worked post Roswell on whatever,
Right.
you know, to discover whatever, do you think they'll come out? Is
No,
there
they
enough?
won't come out. No,
Ah.
no, because they don't trust our government. They see our government has played both sides for too many years,
Mhm.
and they don't know if they're being baited, if they're being set up for a trap. That well, this person is in possession of classified top secret information, and even though we grant them immunity, it's just words. Even on paper, it's just words. What assurance can you give me? How do I know something isn't going to happen before? I mean, even in our judicial system, you get subpoenaed. It doesn't prevent you from having an accident. It doesn't prevent something somebody poisoning your food or your drink in the meantime. And so I think most are still waiting to see what develops. But we have had officers who have already testified regarding like nuclear facility infiltrations like Malmstrom, where the entire line of Atlas missiles shut down. And that's Robert Salas and Dr. Robert Jacobs. They both have testified in Washington. And we were the ones who were pushing from the very beginning that if they do not provide immunity to whistleblowers, nothing will ever become of this. And so it's all behind closed doors at the moment. But the next thing that we are pushing for now is open door hearings. In other words, let's televise it. Let's put it on C-SPAN, put it on television.
Absolutely.
Let the world finally, because as long as it remains behind closed doors, then they will trot out the same worn out cliche explanation. Well, it concerns national security, so we will be unable to, release any reports on their testimony because of, the big national security, claim once again. And we've seen that time and time again. So now we're pushing for open hearings.
This national security claim, I wish I could use it with my wife. Look, I can't tell you. It doesn't work on everything, But they come up always with the same thing. It's national security. I'm kind of like right now. I'm asking myself: it's going to be really difficult for them to come out anyhow because they have to admit that they lied.
Right.
I think that's a bigger issue than people actually, because there are legal consequences down the road.
There are, and when you look back, many of them, especially again, the Roswell witnesses, and just about every one of them now passed on. The World War II generation, they're almost gone. They took an oath to here in the States, our Constitution, as well as to God, that they would never speak again about this. And it's another reason that so many of them, they waited till their deathbeds. They waited until they were dying before they finally confided to their wives, their children, about what happened. And fortunately, we have been publicized enough that the families then have come to us, or will find them after the fact. We have missed witnesses by a year, by months, by a week, even by 2 days on one occasion.
Oh, man.
And there's nothing more frustrating. The information is gone forever. But that too, it just smacks of the level of not only sensitivity of what the issue concerns, and the fact that this was the World War II generation, as it's called here, the greatest generation. They knew how to keep secrets. They knew how to maintain their oath of silence.
Donald, you're so right. I think this is a generation that a lot of people, I mean, I grew up with my grandparents, they took care of me and so on and so forth. They saw the atrocities of wars, and these people just have a different approach. So when they gave an oath, I think they took it a lot more serious than a lot of people do today. Okay.
Oh yeah.
I'm
Yes.
definitely convinced about it. But I think that the bigger truth about the whole thing is going to come out. And like you said, you interviewed a lot of people who then actually, in their, deathbeds and said, I got to say the truth. And there's one person I read the book about, and I heard that you had an interview with him, is General Corso.
Yes, I interviewed Corso on 2 occasions, and I found him to be, very his persona, his stature. He was an officer. I had no question. And in checking out his background, he was who he said he was.
Right.
The problem is he did not write the book.
Oh, he didn't write the book. I thought it was his book.
No. And in fact, there was a big dispute between his family and the actual author, who is attorney Dr. William Burns of New York. And that it reads very much like a novel.
It does, yes.
And as a result, even the people that Corso relied on to get information about Roswell, because he wasn't in Roswell at the time. This was just something that he learned of, days thereafter. But he still had to do his homework. And unfortunately, he went to unreliable sources. He went to people that we had exposed as being hoaxes, that they were not genuine. And
wait a sec, the person who wrote the book or Corso went to the wrong people?
Corso relied on false witnesses.
Okay, I understand. Okay.
And I don't know who steered him, because whether it was the actual author or that someone else, I think that might be even more interesting to find out, that here was a potential whistleblower who was coming out and talking as an officer about the day after Roswell, what had transpired after the incident. And then who would have led him to the bogus witnesses in place of, because he didn't come to us. So I think that's something I might look into. Who was Corso in contact with back then, as far as military? And
that's
maybe,
because Corso has the credentials. I mean, it's proven he's a real McCoy. I mean, he wasn't lying about that, So I'm curious about. Well, there's something else pops into my mind. Wasn't there a nurse that actually once came out and said she saw the alien?
Well, that was the testimony from the mortician.
Mortician, exactly. They had to embalm somehow, and and he was brought to the whole thing. Yes, I remember.
And he had received numerous phone calls at the Ballard Funeral Home. That was the name of the funeral home, about preservation of bodily tissue and fluids that had been exposed to the elements for days, and if they had any child-sized coffins, caskets, which was quite intriguing. I mean,
scary.
Did you have an incident involving children? Well, no, but we thought we should have them in storage should the case arrive. Well, and then we tracked down the son of the truck driver, who even was contracted by the funeral home to pick up the child-sized caskets in Amarillo, Texas. So we were able to confirm all that as well.
Oh,
but
wow.
The nurse, we know who she was. She died within a few years after the incident of a childhood disease. Her name was Adeline Fatton. She's in the base yearbook. She was assigned to the base hospital back at that time. And we missed her by quite a few years. But there were other nurses involved who we tracked down. And there was another nurse by the name of Mary Lowe, who was clearly involved.
Exactly.
And
That's the lady. Yes.
and what was interesting is that when we first talked to Mary Lowe, the first question she asked us was, "Did Glenn Dennis tell you about me?" And the point is, he had not. He did not give us the name. We had we found her through another source, and then we had to investigate, and we finally tracked her down. But how she brought him up as though there was a connection when the mortician never made the connection to us. So it's like we found another one. So, and that's what the adventure of all this, Andre, the idea that whenever you strike a gold nugget, you find another piece of the mosaic, the painting, and it fits. And it all makes sense. And it all keeps pointing away from this being a balloon or anything else of that nature. And it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And here we are after all these years. And even the presidents of the United States talk about Roswell as though someday we're going to release the files.
I think it's going to be. You think we're going to still be alive when they come out?
What's interesting about even when June of 2 years ago, when they came out with the first Pentagon report to the Pentagon, to Congress, and they limited the scope of their investigation back to 2004.
Yeah.
Now, why didn't you go back to post World War II? Why didn't you go back to 1940s? Why only 2004? Well, for me, the answer was quite evident that, and just as Andre, you were talking about Space Force, because that becomes a fallback. Space Force, China, Russia, that if all else fails, oh, well, we just determined that this was new technology developed for Space Force. If you go back to 1947, how could you, the skies were virgin back then. Jet and rocket propulsion were in their infancy. And the only thing it could be was an intelligence off the planet. But going back just the last 20 years, you tighten, that focus. And so that was also very revealing, very intentional, that they had no idea opening us up all the way back to 47. And certainly then Roswell would come up.
Actually, the limitation of the 2021, I think it was in June 2021, the limitations of the paper they brought out from Congress said more about what actually is going on than if they would have said, okay, it's BS. All right, let's take a look at everything. We don't believe it anyhow. But since they limited all this in such a concise manner and not really saying anything, that got me so curious. And I said, you know what? In Austria you say du riechst den Braten. You're smelling the food in the oven. Something's cooking, something's there. They're trying to hide something. That's very interesting.
There's fire behind the smoke.
There's fire behind. Exactly. That's it. Yeah. Yes. If we I'd like to go back to Roswell. So the army retrieved everything.
Right.
And they brought it to Bryce Patterson Air Base, or where was it brought to then?
Everything transited through Roswell, but then there was additional wreckage that was taken to White Sands Proving Grounds and up to Los Alamos. And you raise an interesting point that whenever we're asked today, where do you believe all the wreckage is? Where do you believe all the evidence is today? Here in the States, the government/military doesn't manufacture anything. Everything is contracted out into the private sector. And as a result, through the years, we have had firsthand witnesses at Boeing, at Lockheed, at Los Alamos, at Battelle, at Rand, at Hughes, at Bureau of Standards, all describing efforts to reverse engineer the technology from this craft from 1947. So when I'm asked, where do you think it is today? I can honestly say, I don't believe the government even has it any longer. They've lost track, that they piecemeal it. And therein, getting back to what former President Dwight Eisenhower warned us about here in America, about the military industrial complex, that the more you empower these government contract industries, the more powerful they become. And as a result, that's who become the big secret keepers. Because here in the States, our freedom of information, you can't go after any of those companies. You can go after the government, but you can't go after the actual people who are trying to find the on button from this craft in 1947.
Do you think they found the on button?
No, I still believe it's a cover up of ignorance, that it's such a quantum leap between our technologies that it's been minuscule at best. And as a result, they still don't know from where, from why, from who. So what do they announce? They can acknowledge the existence of the phenomena, but they're just as much in the dark as most of us are. And in fact, in many ways, I always tell people in the media after they interview even a high-ranking officer, I always tell them, keep in mind, you're still dealing with someone who has been highly compartmentalized. They only know what they have had access to. They only have a need to know within so many parameters, so to speak. I'm not. I can come at this from every direction, and I'm not beholden to any government. And as a result, I believe I have a lot more information about this than they do, and they know it.
I think you have evidence is compelling. And I think that's the important thing, because they don't talk about the things you're talking about. The evidence is there and people can listen to you. And for me, it's very compelling. I just have a question, because I'm totally with you. I don't think we found the on button, because I follow up a different question. But I kind of have this kind of, how should I say? Corso talks about that a lot of things have been reverse engineered. Do you think there's any truth to that?
No, because we would see it.
Okay.
Because, we're still using rockets. When I think back, when we landed on the moon in July of 1969, the next target date was a manned mission to Mars in 1986. 86. So we're approaching 40 years later, and they're still talking about someday.
They're still trying to get back to the moon.
Precisely, after 50 years.
Right.
Can anyone imagine where the world may be today if the Apollo program would have continued extent after all this time?
And a lot of questions would have been answered, I think.
A lot of questions would have been answered. And this idea that now NASA is investigating the UAPs. Well, not one of them has any background.
Yeah, what, $200,000 or $250,000? What are you going to investigate?
They'll pay their salaries for a few months. That's about it.
If at all. Yes, I agree.
If at all. And again, they have no background. They have no connection with the history. They're not even students of the subject. So on what basis are they even going to approach this? So they're going to focus on what happens in the present. New reports that come in, they're maybe going to do a little cursory investigation, and it's still going to leave them the out of it being Chinese, Russian, or Space Force. It's ours. Nothing to worry about. It's ours.
I see a big controversy right now is happening is, okay, the NASA got into the game because there's Space Force, and they're kind of like worried about the territory and the funding, because and there's this kind of like the battle of who's, the Air Force is actually also responsible for the ICBMs and so on and so forth. So who's responsible for what? So it has to do with funding and everything.
It does. That is the bottom line. It all is based on the budgets. Who, as far as is able to, accrue as far as more money from Congress here in America.
I watched a lot of your interviews, and I really, what I appreciate a lot about you, that you're a very factual person. You pinpoint things. You say, okay, this is this, this is this, this is this, and
Thank you.
I
Dr.
really
Hynek
appreciate.
built
I'm
that into me.
you got brainwashed by Hynek. So I have a scientific background. I'm a geologist. I tend to repeat that, but we tend we. For the audience, we like to invite people also to speculate, okay? Because
Yes.
there's so much right now happening. And we were talking about all the way down from Skinwalker Ranch, his Stalin. And I'm 60. I'm like nuts and bolts kind of UFO. That's the way I grew up. And I like, but there's so much happening right now. Can you help us understand? I mean, I like the Roswell thing because that's what I grew up with. And I was like, okay, that's in some way that's going to be provable with your work and with the people you're working. At one day we're going to say, okay, look, we got the hard evidence. But right now there's so much on the table. What's going on?
And that's where we also have to be careful, because it's almost, as I described, a repeat of what happened back in 47, where they flooded the area with stories of all these down weather balloons. And so there's so much, as you said, that's on the table today, that there's going to be an attrition point where people are just going to, I don't want to hear about it anymore, because it never amounts to anything.
Right.
And aside from Roswell, everything else is fleeting. You see it, maybe you photograph it, but it's gone. Now you see it, now you don't. With Roswell, it's all encompassing. And you're talking about the actual hardware. Like I have always said, it's like I want to be able to go across the street and kick the tires on the car.
Right.
And the very last time I had dinner with Hynek before he died, and I will never forget when he was pounding his fist on the table, and he was going, "Don, it's smacking more and more of nuts and bolts." In other words, it's something that interacts with our environment. It's something that creates depressions in the ground and swirled areas of grass, and it breaks branches, and it's tracked on radar. It's physical. It's something that our eyes are not lying about. And I think that's also when like the CIA now, they've done it twice. They did it back in the late 90s, and they're doing it again. That, well, what people have been seeing all these decades are spy planes.
Yeah.
Like in the 60s and 70s, they were seeing U-2 spy planes. And it's like, we put out a quick press release and we went, "Thank you. You're acknowledging that people were seeing hardware. They weren't hallucinating. They weren't seeing balloons. They were actually," but then, just to set the record straight, you have a very small fleet of U-2s. They certainly can't account for all the sightings around the world. And isn't it true that they also fly at extremely high altitude where they are not visible with the naked eye? Well, they wouldn't respond to us regarding that, but it's like, no. Don't play these games with us, because we've done our homework. We know what your fallbacks are, and we're fully prepared to answer them now if they fall back on Space Command or Russia or China. And I've been to China numerous times, and I've been to Russia. And so I know their capacity. I know I had dinner one evening with two of the cosmonauts, and they drilled me for 2 hours on Roswell. And I'm sorry, China has nothing on our military here in the States. So the idea that they've somehow, developed something that defies the laws of physics. No. Again, do your homework. They're not there. They'll never be there. No.
And to come up with a primitive excuse of a balloon,
Yes,
is pathetic. I think it would be more interesting if they would have said, you know what, this is some kick-ass Russian deal. We gotta, but to say it's a balloon, kind of, I don't know. It's really kind of boggles me. I have two questions I'd like to follow up because you're knowledgeable about this whole subject. I read also Jacques Vallée's book on Trinity.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was like a year or a year and a half earlier than
the
Roswell.
claim is 1945, 2 years before.
Okay. is what's your take on that?
I did a whole paper that was published in about a half a dozen UFO magazines around the country, around the world, for that matter. And I was at a meeting with Jacques just last week, and I have another one coming up end of this week, and he knows where I stand on this.
Tell him we want to talk to him. He should come on our podcast too. We should have you and Jacques Vallée. I would love that. That would be so awesome.
I could arrange it.
That'd be
And,
wonderful.
as long as we don't talk about Trinity, because their primary witness I interviewed over 20 years ago.
The
and he
farmer,
was
the farmer.
This Remy Baca.
Ah, okay.
And at the time, he was claiming that it happened in 1947 and that it was connected to Roswell.
Oh,
And then
wow.
he sent us pictures of what we then identified as an internal flange mechanism of a windmill that he was claiming was a piece of the flying saucer.
Okay.
And then once he's talking to Jacques and Paula Harris, he changed it to 1945 and that it happened at a different location. And we have him on tape asking us, how can I make a lot of money with this story?
Okay. I'm really relieved. You know why?
Yeah.
If we have one crashed UFO, I can live with it. But having two UFO being too dumb to steer their UFO in the right way and it crashes, it would be too much. But why did you think Roswell crashed? I mean, why did that UFO actually crash?
There, to begin with, it was a mid-air explosion. It was at higher altitude and it rained debris that covered an area of almost a mile long. Even Major Marcel and Captain Sheridan Cabot of CIC, counterintelligence.
Marcel was a guy who held up the...
He was ordered to hold up the pieces of the kite.
Yeah,
right,
he came out afterwards and said, no, that was BS.
It was not made on this earth. That's what he said before he died over. It was not made on this earth. Okay. So there was a severe lightning storm that we've confirmed through the Stallion Weather Network at that time. We have the documentation coming off the Southern Capitan Mountains at that very evening, July 2nd, between 11 and 11:30 that evening. The other thing that we've looked into, and we're going to be looking into more, is we had a radar engineer, formerly with the CIA, who asked me during an interview, he said, Don, you had radar facilities all around that region, Kirtland, White Sands, Roswell, Cannon Air Force Base, Vaughn, north of White Sands in conjunction with the rocket launches. He said, you need to check where they all intersect because you need to keep in mind, Don, that radar was in its beginnings at that time. It was undisciplined. It was unregulated, that the frequencies were different depending on where you were located. And as a result, it created a lot of interference. And whenever these radar lobes actually ran into one another, it would jam even our own aircraft. It would cause us to lose as far as instrument and guidance and a compass, all that. Well, we did that. And guess where they all intersected?
Roswell?
In that very county where it crashed.
Ah, okay. That
So
explains.
he is suggesting that because we've been skeptical about the radar question, he says you need to investigate that. You need to look into that because he says, as a radar expert, I believe that may have been the reason for the crash. So it's something that we're getting ready to look into.
I'm pretty sure there's a lot to that. I mean, if you just look at the X-rays way back when, I don't know when the X-rays came out. I mean, they practically nuked the people with incredible gamma rays. And so probably the radar was just as powerful because they didn't know what the hell they were doing. And they were just like, bam, out there. And that probably caused a lot of havoc. Yeah.
And he assured me it did. And as a result, I kind of always brushed it off. I thought it was a bit too science fiction, oriented, but coming from an expert, I intend to, and
I
we're
think
going to be able to
that's,
show that on a map, that's where they all intersected.
I'm pretty sure. Also, if you got a physicist there and he did some calculations with whatever they use, then I'm probably that's very valuable information. And you'll have the military knock on your door and says, "Give me the information because now we found a way how to get control of the UFOs." So that's probably is going to be important.
What's interesting is that there was a movie that came out maybe 5 years later or so called Earth versus the Flying Saucers. And what they used to bring down the saucers at the end was a high frequency, high audio frequency that totally disabled their gyro, their guidance systems, and made them crash. So they were already thinking about that back then.
That's absolutely fascinating. So let's zip to today, and let's take out like the Nimitz case, because I think that's for me pretty real. What for you are other sightings or phenomena where you would say, okay, that's credible? I mean, because I think you're a very baseline, you're fundamented, you look at facts and so on and so forth. And I try to work about this whole thing too. I like the phenomenon and everything. I like to know more about it. And there are a lot of cases out there, and it's kind of almost too much for me right now. What out of your perspective is like one of those things where you say, okay, I think there's a lot of credibility to that?
You just made the comment about there's too much. There's too much.
Right.
And Heineck used to always remind us that, and as an astronomer, he had a very difficult time accepting the vast distances between planets. And he would use the analogy that if you took from a deck of cards, playing cards, not the actual width, but the thickness of a single playing card, would equal the distance from the Earth to the moon. How many playing cards to our nearest star system, Alpha Centauri? 4.3 light years. How many playing cards? Nobody ever comes close. 19 miles of playing cards. 19 miles. And one equals the Earth to the moon.
Not even Las Vegas uses many playing cards, so that's a lot.
So Heineck would then suggest it would be much more acceptable that we were dealing with something off the planet if we'd have 1 or 2 good sightings a year. Something suggesting that the traversing of such great distances. But this idea that we're having sightings every hour of every day somewhere around the world, and it's why more and more of us are now considering the possibility that we're dealing with something interdimensional. Mm-hmm. That is something that exists around us, and it's able to pop in and out. It becomes very physical when it comes into our dimension, but that it's able to slip through a portal, whether it's a time portal or a dimension, that type of thing. But it's the reason that we're just being bombarded. Or the alternative is, this is again part of the noise, that we're being bombarded with all this boy crying wolf, so to speak, to the point that people will just summarily dismiss all of it and go, come on. They're coming out of the woodwork here. They're just, every day we have more and more UFO reports, and it can have the opposite, behavior, opposite response. Today, whenever I hear of a UFO report, I just, everything pales compared to Roswell. Because with Roswell, hands on. It's not just something filmed in the sky. No.
It's the biggest story in the UFO
of the millennium, we say.
Yeah. It's the biggest story. And if there's one thing that I'm still thinking about are the alien bodies. So yes. I hear controversial information. How many bodies were there in total?
Okay. There was a secondary body site along the trajectory line from the debris field
Mhm.
There were two bodies found atop a bluff, which we've had first-hand witnesses to have taken us independently to the very location, 2.5 miles east, southeast of the debris field. And then there was a final impact site, 35 miles north of Roswell, 25 miles from the debris field, along that same trajectory line. And that's where the remains of an egg-shaped pod, a capsule, size of a small, like a Volkswagen Beetle.
Mhm.
And that's where two additional bodies and a survivor were recovered. And oh yes, we have first-hand military and and civilian to the survivor.
Okay, with all due respect, I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit. Okay,
Please.
the UFO crashes, why aren't
Mhm.
they smithereens just like everything else of the UFO? I mean, how can the body have survived the crash?
Well, I mentioned a capsule, like an escape pod,
Ah, okay.
something that was projected. It was ejected that went on for 25 more miles before impacting, before crashing.
Okay,
And
so they
that's
had like
where,
this safety kind of whatever pod around them to protect themselves.
or they always talk about like a dome disc. Maybe that dome is an internal capsule,
Okay.
that it's the outer saucer that exploded, and that capsule, that cabin is ejected, to another location.
Well, when I talk to my kids, my daughter's studying technical mathematics, so she's very skeptical. And I said, well, you must think this UFO had inertia, because it was floating in space, so probably it kept part of its inertia when it crashed. So inside you don't feel anything, and that's why they survived. But what do you think the bodies went to?
One survived, right?
One survived, yes, and the other two passed away. But what do you think? What did or think? I mean, probably you talk to people who know where the bodies went to.
Well, there were two body flights. One was a C-54 that was piloted by Captain O.W. Henderson that went out first. And then there was a second body flight that went out. It was a B-29 called the Straight Flush. And it was piloted by a Captain James Eubanks. And we tracked down even the crew on those two flights. They both confirmed
Wow.
what their cargo was, and they both flew directly to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. And in fact, we have a documentation from a Colonel, Marion Magruder, who was a triple ace from World War II. And he was part of the War College class of 47, 48. And before he died in 1995, he gave deathbed testimony to his four sons, independent of one another. And he described how their War College assignment was to Wright-Patterson. And they were shown not only wreckage from Roswell, but they were taken then into a dark room, and the lights came on, and then inside a glass room was the survivor. And how he felt sorry that we were treating it like a lab animal. And it was his information that had died shortly thereafter from all the experimentation we were subjecting it to. And then we found his assignment documentation that he indeed was assigned to Wright-Pat in April of 1948. So just 9 months after Roswell, just as he said, he was assigned to Wright-Pat. We can document that.
That's what I love about your work. You can I think Steve Jobs once said, sometimes at the moment things don't make sense, but when you look back, you can start connecting the dots. Then it starts making sense. And this is exactly what you're doing. And this is absolutely phenomenal. I actually believe that the whole thing with the bodies is going to be the smoking gun, because I'm sure they did they kept some samples, and I don't know, DNA sequencing came, whatever, 40, 50 years later, So eventually there are going to be people, and probably not so much the technical people, but the medical people who have maybe also other oaths. I actually have the bigger hope that we're going to have a whistleblower in that area, in the medical field.
Agreed. In fact, that's what we have been working probably more diligently than we have associates who have worked on the metallurgy, who have then tracked down the first-hand witnesses at all the aerospace companies, which I had mentioned earlier. But you are absolutely correct. In fact, we are pretty confident where a number of the bodies are being stored, because you would certainly preserve unique specimens cryogenically. And we are very sure where a number of them are today. And even back at that time, we tracked down doctors who specialized in spinal disorders. And we found Dr. Lejeune Foster, and she was the doctor who was assigned to examine the actual skeletal structure of the beings. And then there were other doctors who were involved in the preliminary autopsies, both at Roswell and then at Wright.
You got me. Now I'm curious. Oh, okay. Tell us about these beings. What did these doctors say? Were they similar to us? I mean, just tell us about this. Is really interesting. Were they able to say about the bone structure or something? Did they have a rib cage? Was the spine different? Did they have whatever, more parts, less parts? Would you say, did anybody make an indication that they're related to humans? I mean, in the widest sense?
Yes. They were able to draw conclusions such as one of the doctors involved had even consulted with a number of Soviet doctors at that time, because they were becoming more and more concerned about long-term zero gravity on the human body. And they went back and they re-examined the bodies recovered at Roswell. And according to this one doctor who we spoke with, and we name him in one of our books, he said that the Russians agreed that that's precisely how the human body would start to look after prolonged zero gravity, just as the body at Roswell. Right. That the muscles would atrophy to the point that there would hardly be any muscle, and that the heads would look larger and larger in comparison, in perspective, and that even the eyes would get larger and larger because you would only have, artificial light sources, that type of thing.
So actually, we can speculate that this is like beings that evolved in space travel. So like a generational spaceship that they evolved in time.
They actually tossed around the suggestion that we were dealing with something that was artificially created, like clones. That first of all, they all look the same. And secondly, that if they're designed strictly for deep space travel, that's their only agenda, their only mission. And as a result, that's they appear the way they do because that's how they were actually perceived, how they were designed.
Did any of the sorry, the connection's a little bit bad, so I there's a time lag. I don't want to interrupt you. I apologize. Did any of the doctors or the medical people say anything about the organs or the bones?
That they were similar to human, but that some, like there wasn't a gallbladder, there wasn't a spleen, as we would know it, that there were less ribs, that the spinal cord was obviously, it didn't have the same number of vertebra, that type of thing, that the forearms were longer, elongated in conjunction as far as to the upper arms, that type of thing. They didn't have rotator cuffs. There were some of the details that were mentioned.
No rotator cuffs in the shoulder.
Right. And yet the description that, and very often the description in the Akami is that the arms just kind of hang there. That they don't, you really see them maneuvering or doing anything with their arms. And the other thing is no teeth.
How many fingers did they have?
That was something that came out as a result of the autopsy video. back
Uh-huh.
in the early 90s, but 4 fingers and an opposable thumb.
Okay, so similar
Mhm.
to ours.
Yes.
This is what fascinates me. This is anthropomorphic idea that even if they're cloned or cybernetic, biogenic, whatever robots, that they are similar to us. You know, they're not whatever. They don't have 7 hands to whatever do whatever they have, or 6 hands or something, but 2 hands, 2
I
feet.
I asked Dr. Michael Swords about this a number of times, and he's a famous biologist, a teacher from the University of Michigan in Kalamazoo. He's now retired. But if we consider that every element, every alloy, every metal that we have here on planet Earth is extant throughout the universe. So, and he said we should expect the same thing as far as with biologics, with the idea that if we're talking about other life forms, and it would be contingent certainly on the atmosphere, on the pressure, the gravity, that type of thing. But nonetheless, that just as whether the depths of the sea or the highest peaks of the mountains, we have almost every possible condition here on planet Earth that may exist on any other planet.
Mhm.
And yet, generally, all the species here on Earth all have 2 eyes, ears, you know, they have a skeleton and thing. And so should we expect them to be bug-eyed monsters and 4-eyed creatures and, 6 arms and all this? And he would say, no, we should not expect them to look much different than we do.
I absolutely agree. I think, but that's a whole different philosophy and question and speculation. But I think there's a lot of sense that some things happen the way they do, and there's a purpose in that. I think that's a different question. But coming back to the speculation you mentioned before, because there's a lot on the table right now. Do you expect that Roswell, because a lot of people are actually saying, I call it lovingly the Atlantis theory, because they're like saying they're living here amongst us like Atlantis, and we just
Mhm.
didn't know about them, and they're here right now, and
Right.
they show themselves. Which of these hypotheses would you kind of lean to? Is it really extraterrestrial? I mean, I have this problem that between extraterrestrial, if they can transverse whatever, all this grand distance, or you're interdimensional or a time traveler, I don't think we
Mhm.
will notice the difference, because how can we tell the difference of this technology? They're probably very similar, But
Correct.
nevertheless, I mean, after all these speculations, where would you be leaning to?
I'm totally open to every and all possibilities. You had just mentioned time travel. Even Heineck, we would talk about time travel. The idea that it's us in the future. And there too, we have to, if we would throw, and I don't even call them abduction accounts, I call them missing time, because there are many alternative explanations. But let's say that people are being abducted, and there is, this interaction suggesting that there is a DNA connection. Well,
Mhm.
then you're either talking about that we were seeded here by them in the past, or it is us in the future. There has to be some biological connection, and we have to consider that. That's the wonderful thing about Roswell, in that if in going from a skeptic to where I'm almost totally convinced, I have to then be open-minded to every other situation, every other possibility. I can't just, no, I'll believe Roswell, but everything else is impossible. No. Roswell makes everything else possible, because for the first time,
I
you're
agree.
dealing with the question, are we being visited? Are we dealing with an intelligence off the planet? What is their mission here? I like what, like even Carl Jung suggested, that, we may be the universal insane asylum. That's the big attraction. Or, planet Earth is the galactic zoo, as the late John Keel suggested, that type of thing. So it's like, what makes us so interesting? And there too, when you consider, as far as life on other planets, the idea that here we are, the third sun, the third planet from our sun, you wouldn't even see us until you were right in our neighborhood due to the brightness of the sun. You'd have no idea we were even here. And then to keep coming back every day and abduct, hundreds and thousands of people before you figure out, yeah, we're all different. We all have, different biologies, that type of thing. So to me, that again suggests something much closer. And it may be something as simple as they have a base operation at the bottom of the oceans or dark side of the moon or on one of the other planet moons, but they're close by. They're not, traveling from A to B back and forth. For us, what again, it just, to me, that's more unbelievable than the fact that they exist.
Well, I think there's so much circumstances and evidence right now that we have to everybody should be looking there. And I think the question should be a lot bigger in the public too. Who do you think is going to be the first lucky guy to actually come out? Is it going to be somebody who's going to whistleblow something on Roswell? Is it going to be James Webb? Are we going to find life on Mars? What do you think right in the next, let's say 5-10 years, we're going to have the first evidence of extraterrestrial life, even if it's only microbial on Mars or whatever, a worm on Venus or whatever? Who do you think, who's going to be the lucky one to pronounce that we found extraterrestrial life?
We've always hoped, as far as with all the exploration on Mars, for example, that it would be a major discovery nonetheless, but nonetheless, you see still how resident NASA is in considering that there may even be microorganisms on the planet, let alone accepting that there may have been intelligent life on the planet, that Mars was covered with water at one time, that it would have had all the necessary ingredients of having vegetation, and as a result producing oxygen within the atmosphere and then conducive to life, and that they're willing to budge or unwilling to budge, that they still can't acknowledge that. And to me, that would soften the blow, because that would condition people, first of all, to accept that, well, we're not unique in that sense, that there is life, even microscopic, on other planets. The building blocks are there. And then we would also hope that if you want to take it then to the next level, you would acknowledge Roswell, because it demonstrates that they are just as mortal, just as fallible as we are. They crash, they die. So they're not superhuman in that regard, that they too lead, they live mortal lives. And so we like to see if they feel there has to be that transition of education. And so they could start with Mars, and then they could jump right to Roswell.
I agree. I agree
people
totally.
Would be very receptive. And oh my God, we've all grown up with the race to the moon, and we've grown up with Star Wars and Star Trek and everything. We have been so conditioned to accept this. And then the argument, they always come back, well, what if we're still not mature enough? What if we still can't handle it? And I say, well, back in 1947, this was unprecedented. They had nothing. There was nothing in the Army field manual, how to deal with a crash flying saucer. There was nothing in the literature, nothing. I mean, you had Flash Gordon, you had Buck Rogers, the radio, but their spaceships were rockets, and the aliens looked like humans.
Right.
That's how imaginative we were back then. So this was something beyond the pale. And there was no panic. There was no mass suicide. These people, they all raised their families. They worked their jobs. They kept going to church. They lived out their lives, and they held it in their hands. If they were ready back then, my God, if we have digressed, if we have, gone to the point that right now, oh, no, we can't risk the culture shock. We can't risk the effect it's going to have on religion. And, the economy is going to be thrown into no. Those are your excuses. They're not ours. We're ready, and we have been all along. And for those of us who've been working on this, my God, let us lead the way, because we've been doing all the spade work. We live with it. We live and breathe it. And it hasn't changed anything in my life. I still enjoy a good joke. I still, enjoy a good restaurant. I still, watch a good movie. It's in the back of my mind, but no, the thought that it is, if anything, I don't sweat the small things any longer.
Mhm.
Because you look at a much bigger picture and you realize, hey, piece of cake, go with the flow. Have fun with it.
I tell a lot of my friends that are skeptics. I said, you know what, the idea that we're alone in the universe kind of freaks me out more than I think, I have the philosophy the universe is jam-packed full, and we're just starting to realize that sometime. But I agree absolutely with you that I think the first process will be the soft disclosure, preparing the people says, hey, look, there was some kind of worm on Mars, or whatever, we found a fossil or something, and then it'll open up the minds, and I think it will be then easier for the government to say, okay, we have something to say, and we're going to be honest about this. We don't know what the hell this is. We don't know. Well, we know what it is, but we don't know how it works. We don't know, like you say, where's the on button, and here it is. Help us out. I think it will be easier if they came out now. I think they will get a lot of scrutiny. Why you lied to us, and why didn't you tell us?
Exactly. And the culpability, the fact that starting with Roswell and for all these years since, they have played very rough with witnesses. Not only have they smeared them, discredited them, cost them their jobs, their marriages, but they threatened them with physical violence. Children back at the time of Roswell were told they would never see their parents again. Parents were told, we will kill your children if you ever talk. So who's going to be responsible for all that? You want to talk about a class action suit, all those families?
Cool.
And saying that here in America, over a weather balloon, you were threatening to kill my children? No. Big, big responsibility. And who's going to own up to that? Who's going to accept, the blame?
I
no
have
politician.
No, well, God, who believes a politician anyway? I mean,
no.
God, let's not get into that. But
I know, same here.
I remember there was this famous Israeli, and I'm so bad with names, and he was part of the Israeli space program, and I think he was a physicist. And he recently, I think 2 years ago, he wrote a book, or 3 years ago, he wrote a book, and he claimed that Israelis and Americans are in contact. I mean, this is far out there.
You're talking Dr. Avi Loeb.
No, not Avi Loeb.
Not Loeb, because he's also from Israel. Okay.
No, there was this. He was part of the Israeli space program. He's, I think, in his 80s or 90s, and he wrote a book, and he was claiming that the Americans and the Israelis, and they're already, and there's a base on Mars, and they've been there, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. It irritated me in a sense, because it discredits in the eyes of so many people who kind of believe, but they're on the kind of like, don't know which side they're on, and it makes it difficult. Why do you think? Do you think he's part of a false op or false information progress? Why is he saying this? I mean, he's a very believable, he's got great credentials too.
Right. And I think, and especially very often people who have infallible credentials, unquestionable credentials, that they very often are allowed to spread disinformation. You mentioned Bob Lazar.
Bob Lazar, yes.
And we know, based on our own investigations, that elements within Project Blue Book, for example, would take their own personnel into a film room, a video room, and a projector would start rolling, and up on the screen would be some of the most fantastic gun camera footage, clearly showing, saucers, dome discs, no wings, no tail section, superior, technology. And there would typically be someone in the room in a white smock with a clipboard, not watching the screen, but watching them, making notes as to their reaction, their behavior. And then we started finding more and more witnesses that were being shown cadavers. They would be taken down into a lower level at a particular base, and they would pull out a slab, and there would be a body, whether it was the real thing or not, or a composite, a replica. But nonetheless, again, they would make note of their reaction. Like it's testing the waters to see how we are maturing as far as the subject matter.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd like to believe that at some point, someone is going to decide, I think they're ready. Unfortunately, most of these people who are calling the shots know nothing on this subject.
Mm.
And in mentioning Lazar, if I cite the example of Edward Snowden here in the States,
Right.
whether one believes he's either a traitor or a hero, it's pretty 50-50 here in the States. But either way, it serves as an example of what happens to a true whistleblower.
Right.
You have to flee for your life. The idea, and who would have thought in their wildest imagination that a whistleblower in America, of all places, would have to flee to Russia for asylum?
Yeah, that's crazy, isn't it?
Unheard of.
And
It's
plus,
crazy.
I don't get it because what Snowden said, everybody was like, we knew it anyhow. It wasn't
Yeah.
really a big deal,
That's right. That's right. The NSA was spying on America. Okay. But the point is, with Lazar, he was left unfeathered. He
Right.
was able to go out and speak freely on this, and nobody paid him any mind. And so my personal belief is that he was allowed to see certain things. And once again, almost like on a grander scale, like the doctor in the smock with the clipboard, let's let him tell what he's seen and see how the media, see how the public respond to it.
Now I come to a point that this is so interesting what you say. Boys, I'm sorry, I don't want to steal your show, but I got a billion questions.
That's too late.
Sorry? It is too late.
It's too late.
It's too late. All right. I have the question. I'm really curious about, because what we're talking about, all this psyops and everything that's going on in the background. Okay. When the hell did this start? Because I can't imagine. I mean, this is very high level disinformation that is happening. There's very high level understanding how it will react in the public and how you can manipulate them, and or is it so easy to manipulate? That could be the simple answer. It's just so easy. Look at today with social media. Everything's so wishy-washy. But they started something already. In the late 1940s, they started telling the people different stories and brainwashing them. Where did this knowledge come from? How to do that?
Mm-hmm.
Because psychology wasn't really that old at that time.
Much of it certainly came through World War II. First of all, like the old saying, loose lips sink ships.
Yeah.
They realized that you can't even entrust your family. You can't even talk to your spouses about what you know to be true. So the military was well trained in keeping secrets. The Manhattan Project, probably the best example of all.
Right.
Most of them never even informed their spouses they were involved through an entire lifetime. Never had any idea. Okay. And then you're dealing not only with the perception that we we need to be able to discredit a witness at the drop of a hat, that they are the expendable ones, that if we need to ruin them for life, we need to get them fired from their jobs, we need to create a smear program, a ridicule program. So when I'm asked, well, where did it begin, Don? And I'll say, well, it actually began, funny you would ask, it began at Roswell. It began within days after the weather balloon press conference in General Ramey's office at Fort Worth, Texas, because it was a few days later, General Ramey, one of the very arbiters of the cover-up, was doing a radio show in El Paso, Texas, where the host of the program commented, well, General, that explains Roswell. Roswell was a weather balloon. We accept that. But what about all the other flying saucer reports from around the country? Isn't it true that flying saucers have been seen in every state throughout the nation? And General Ramey had an answer prepared. He was ready. He responded, that's true. There have been sightings in every state throughout America, except for Kansas, which is a dry state. In other words, they still maintain prohibition. Couldn't drink. So for the first time, only people who over imbibe, only people who drink see flying saucers. That's where it began.
Oh, wow.
And from there, it just took off. It had a life of its own. The cover-up becomes self-perpetuating, but we still have that knee-jerk reaction. Somebody describes something unusual, where were you? What were you drinking? What were you smoking? That type of thing.
Right.
We've been indoctrinated. We've been programmed to react in that manner. Even if we believe, we still make a joking remark about it because that's how we've been schooled. And it started with Roswell. So they saw the need to not only cover up, but they also saw the need. We have to make sure that when the next one happens, people will just summarily dismiss it because they've been educated not to believe it. Even don't believe your lying eyes. We'll tell you what to believe.
And I think that's changing right now. I really have the feeling that this is we're just right now on this precipice where people are opening up the minds. The Nimitz case has opened up the minds. We're looking out there, Avi Loeb and Gary Nolan, and a lot of people are taking Eric Weinstein. Scientists are taking it more serious too. So I'm hopeful. Even though it's moving slowly. But I actually think that you're onto the bigger question of solving the whole thing, because you just have the bigger, broader base of people, even if it's out of secondhand information right now, because the people who were there in person probably are not alive anymore. But I think going down the line, you're going to find the information. And I think you're going to be the guy on CNN to say, listen here, people, Roswell is real. And I can't wait for that day to happen. Or CNN, Fox News, whoever. Fox News is more open to the question than CNN is. So
Well, thank you. And we've been told to be ready that when Roswell will have its day in court, that we have our attorneys, we have our affidavits, we have our deathbed statements. We're ready. I mean, if I were to get the call and we need you to come and testify before the congressional hearings next week, we're ready. We're ready. We've been building our case for over 30 years now. And we all deserve to know the truth. No question.
I totally agree. And I think we've been, how much time do we still have? Because we've been on for 1.5 hours. I still have a million questions.
Well, part two. We'll do a part two at some point.
I think we should do a part two. Definitely. Donald, it's absolutely phenomenal. Everything just sitting here. I mean, like I said, I believe, yeah, but you're lucky. You've been convinced.
Yeah.
You don't have to believe anymore. You've been convinced, and it's been an honor to talk to somebody who's been convinced, and that makes a big difference.
You raised a lot of great topics, a lot of good questions you posed, and you make me look good. So I thank you for that, Andre. Thank you.
Thank you, Donald, for your time today. And I really hope we can do this again. Okay.
Just let me know, and we'll schedule something, and we'll do a part 2. And by the end of that, we'll say we need to do a part 3.
I hope so. Yes. And the part 3 is we'll tell everybody we have the facts and we have the proof, and we'll show it to you in the part 3. And if you can get Jack Valet someday on board too, I'd love to talk to him.
I'll be talking to Jack end of this week, and I will mention it. And yes. Yeah.
Okay. I wish you a wonderful day. What time is it over there? And you're in Wisconsin, aren't you?
Yeah, just 1:42. So Wisconsin, right?
Okay, so it's
a lot of Germans in our area.
Oh, really? Yeah. Well, I'm Canadian, but I live in Europe. But yeah, I love the world, and I think we're going through a great experience.
Canada's just to the north, so
I know it's not far. It's a good stone throw away. Okay, you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for this conversation. Okay.
We'll see you again.
All right. Take care. Peace and love. Bye-bye.
Peace and love. Thank you.